Good morning. All right. Good morning, Dr. Fingal.
Good morning, Pastor Madelyn.
Oh, wait a second. Yeah. Okay. I was fishing for a doctor there, but that's all right.
Good morning, Dr. Madelyn.
Yeah. Yes. Good. I'm still having fun with that. Hey, let's talk about Bruno. Cool.
Let's completely defy everything we just heard in that song and talk about Bruno.
Let us absolutely talk about Bruno. You know, it seems to me there are a lot of things that people never talk about. And this movie really turns that on its head. We talk a lot about Bruno. I loved this movie, and I couldn't help noticing that the characters fit really well into certain archetypes.
For sure.
A lot of folks noted that the characters fit into Jungian archetypes, and you reminded me that we can't just call them Jungian. What did you tell me?
Yeah. So Carl Jung, way back when, generated these sort of symbolic or prototypical examples of people, of personality types, and that theory goes back to kind of the early 1900s, but by 1981, a kind of expert on substance abuse and dysfunctional family structures and things like that by the name of Sharon Wegscheider Cruz. She kind of modified Jung's archetypes. And I don't want to get too sort of wonky about this, but basically she took his 12 and kind of focused in on a smaller subset of those that, to her thinking, exemplified kind of the most common dysfunctional roles that people have in alcoholic families. And since then, the use of these terms has been expanded to include all different kinds of family dysfunction, emotionally and psychological disturbance. The very first song in Encanto, which for people who haven't seen it, it's a great film, really worth checking out. It's called the Family Madrigal, and it talks about the various members of the family and each of their special gifts. And early on, we're exposed to kind of the tragedies, the trauma that the family was exposed to that kind of created their magic, if you will. So it is kind of cool how each of the different characters seems to kind of map nicely to a different kind of family dysfunction.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that the trauma is intergenerational because it really is. And, you know, even in scripture, in religion, in the Bible, it talks about the sins of the father will be visited on 7 generations, and that's not I think supposed to be read as a punishment from God, but rather a warning about intergenerational trauma. What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. There's so many things that I read as allegorical or symbolic in the Bible, and that seems literal to me. That checks out. I mean, I think 7 generations might be about right in terms of, for really devastating trauma, it can take a very, very long time for that to work its way out within a family.
And we're seeing it in this. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think family systems theory is tied to this as well. Is that correct, to some of the things that we see here?
Absolutely, yeah. Wegscheider Cruz was in addition to her work with substance abuse, she spent a lot of time looking at how families perpetuate trauma without meaning to, without knowing they're doing it. There's this kind of unintentional domino effect that happens across generations where we pass along all kinds of expectations and various kind of roles that people are sort of meant to play in a family or they fall into. And these characters are really a lovely example of that.
So do you want to start with Abuelita, which means little grandma? Do you want to start with her, or should we start with the house itself? What do you think?
Interesting. I mean, let's start. Well, we can kind of talk about both at once, I guess. So Abuela Alma Madrigal. She was kind of the matriarch of the family, um, and she's a really interesting. She might be the most interesting character to me in the bunch. She's not exactly kind of an anti-hero, but she's maybe sort of a grown-up version of the hero, or sort of the golden child. She's kind of in charge of everything, really. And there is a Jungian archetype that Wegscheider Cruz doesn't talk about, called the ruler. And the flip side to the ruler is the tyrant. Each one of Jung was sort of, one of the things that I love most about his theory talks about the idea that for each one of the archetypes that we might potentially serve, there's a kind of shadow side to it as well. Everything kind of has a dark and a light side, a yin and a yang to it. And the flip side of being a ruler and having that kind of control over any group is potentially being tyrannical. And Abuela certainly loved her family, and I don't think wanted to be a tyrant, but she did have that effect on people. She was able to maintain a kind of airtight control over what happened within the family, who talked about how the family looked to each other and to the outside world in particular. She was all about resistance to acknowledging that there were any potential problems in their world. And that ultimately became the source of most of the family's problems.
You know, a thing that I find really interesting about her is that when the initial trauma occurred, this takes place in Colombia, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And when the initial trauma occurred, she then had to hold her family together. She had to be strong and do everything she had to do to literally save her family, and she did. But I don't think she knows what to do when there's no external threat.
Yeah, I would agree. And part of what she needed to do in order to be able to manage to keep everyone together, excuse me, is to have this kind of veneer of everything being perfect, which is clearly a veneer. It's very thin, and we literally start to see cracks forming in the house over time. But that kind of denial, that kind of sort of brittle, rigid control over everything, it clearly wasn't going to work. And all it took was a Mirabel, who we'll certainly talk about, to start asking all the wrong questions or all the right questions, and suddenly all that tightly controlled stuff that Abuela was holding on to started to kind of come out at the seams.
So let's talk about the house. That's the home base where everything happens, and we do start to literally see cracks in it. What do you make of that?
I find it remarkable. Do you have an observation? I have lots of thoughts on the casita. What do you think?
I think that for me, in some ways, it represents the veneer, and it also represents the walls, or the barriers, and the things that I mean, there are literal walls in the house, and the things that can't be changed.
Yeah.
It's the what's the word I'm looking for? The castle, the fortress, in many ways. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. I first off, I found the whole sort of lore of how the casita came to be remarkable, because there's literally a kind of the middle of some of the major strife happening in Colombia. And, for those who are aware, obviously, Colombia went through some pretty horrible times for a while, and it was devastating for some of the people who lived there. So she and her husband were kind of both very young, making their way to kind of escape from their village under sort of paramilitary or military aggression. And I don't want to, I guess this whole thing is a spoiler, so we're just going to spoil everything if you haven't seen it. But in any event, there was a tragedy that occurred, and she was devastated. And immediately from that, almost in this sort of Old Testament-y biblical kind of way, this house magically emerged as a kind of a sanctuary for them. Um, and the house was magical and sort of embodied all of the power that she had to kind of keep her family together and all of her hope and all of her reconstruction of the family. But it also embodied all of the trauma and the things they had to do to maintain um, their control without breaking down. I found it amazing that each of the family members, when they received their magical gift, when they sort of had a coming of age, um, there's a space in the house. There's a physical room dedicated to that person with a kind of a magical golden door, indicating that person and their role within the family, their sort of archetype, their gift is sort of their archetype. So it's both memorializing each person and their space in the family story, but it also compartmentalizes everyone. Everyone kind of has their own secret space, which is kind of remarkable to me. There's so many layers to all of this stuff, and I'm not one who loves to kind of delve in and engage in literary criticism and let's figure out what the Goldilocks and the Three Bears is really about, you know. But this story just kind of begs for that, I think.
So why don't we talk about Bruno?
Sure.
Let's talk about Bruno, and why don't we talk about Bruno? Let's talk about his gifts and what he represents and why it's so dangerous to talk about him.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I think most folks who've been writing and talking about this see Bruno as kind of the scapegoat of the family. And the scapegoat's a really interesting role within a family structure. Lots of us have kind of the black sheep in the family, the person who doesn't fit in. Maybe that's some of us. Scapegoats tend to draw attention to themselves, and they can be rebellious, and they sort of fail to play along with the family's expectations, sometimes doing the exact opposite, actually. They might associate with rebellious groups for the sake of it. Bruno wasn't that character necessarily. Bruno was often blamed for nearly every bad thing that happened in the family, which is kind of the role of the scapegoat. But he also tended to call out things that he saw. He was someone who was going to address what he saw as reality, and that goes totally against the rules of this family, which is to continue to sort of perpetuate this myth that everybody is wonderful and everything is perfect and there's no problem in the family. And he was drawn to truth, which sometimes looked very dark compared to this kind of sweetness and light story that the family was telling. So he was, it's not at all surprising that he was rejected by so many people in the family, because he said the things no one else really could say, wanted to say.
And is Mirabel walking in his footsteps? She's becoming the next scapegoat. By the way, the scapegoat, is that also the identified patient that we talk about in family systems theory?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I certainly wonder about that. I found it fascinating. Again, a lot of the articles that talk about this talk about each of these people, but they sort of fall short when they talk about Mirabel or they talk about Abuela. And I wonder whether Abuela might have been sort of the golden child, the hero, and we've got one of those in this generation of the family as well. But whether she has become sort of a grown-up version of that, who experienced trauma and didn't know how to handle that because everything was always perfect and had to kind of create another perfect system. Mirabel, definitely sort of the rebel, the truth teller. She might be seen in a sense as kind of the problem child. And unlike Bruno, who seemed to be doing it sort of accidentally, he wasn't setting out to be rebellious. He was just saying things that he saw. Mirabel's going for it. She's exploring. She's delving in. She's asking all the questions. She's got the courage to ask about the trauma and the old wounds and the dysfunctional patterns and the stuff no one else will talk about. And I mean, Jung would say that the benefit to that, the outcome of that, if you follow it through, is freedom from all of that kind of unnecessary over control.
I thought it was really interesting, and I'm not going to give away the details, but you know there's a resolution. It's a Disney film, there's a resolution. I thought it was really interesting that she literally has to walk in his footsteps when she goes to find him, and that in the resolution of the film, it takes Mirabel and Bruno kind of working together, or Bruno to help Mirabel in order for her to get the resolution in the end. In order for something like that to happen, do we need external help? Do we need somebody to do something like that? Or is it something that people can do on their own usually?
I don't know that there's an either or here. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that people can do, a lot of work that people can do as individuals to try to cope with. I mean, that's a good thing, because if we've had difficult family lives, if we've been in relation to other people in groups and we've suffered, you can't always pull people together. People die, people are physically not available, people refuse to engage in kind of the healing process. So sometimes we're left trying to do the best we can on our own. But I think it's probably better, more effective in an ideal world if we can have multiple people, and certainly multiple generations, engaged in that healing process. There's a kind of an old truism that in intergenerational trauma, the whole idea is that what happens to one person in the system affects the whole system. And lately, there's been kind of this buzzword in the mental health world of trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed has become kind of a big buzz. And for me, one of the things, I read this once and I absolutely adored it. Being trauma-informed requires a paradigm shift from what is wrong with this person to what has happened to this person. And in this case, what is wrong with this family to what has happened in this family. And it's really difficult to do that in isolation. It's really hard to do that work solo. You can, it's possible, but it's very hard. And I think it's much more effective if you can get, for example, a Bruno and a Mirabel sort of leveraging their power, their voice collectively, and sharing their truth. I think it goes a lot further, and I think it was the thing that was necessary to move this family out of being stuck into being able to move forward and heal.
You know, these things apply to larger systems as well, not just to families, and we use this in church work a lot too. We see this in congregations when there's been trauma in congregations, and congregations and other organizations often behave in this way. And trauma-informed care is also something that's been, or trauma-informed ministry is something that's also going around now. So it's interesting that it's something that I think affects lots of systems. I wonder if you've seen this in perhaps school systems that you've worked in, or other areas where it's not just a family, it's a whole system if there's been trauma in a wider area.
Absolutely, yeah. As I think a number of people in the congregation know, I work in multiple places, but my bread and butter job is in the Allentown School District. After the last 2 years, I mean, it's difficult working in an urban setting to begin with. It's difficult for the people who live and engage in systems that are affected by poverty and by community trauma. And after the last 2 years of a pandemic, I'm seeing that it's really hard not to work. It's disingenuous to pretend that you're not working in a trauma-informed environment, because trauma has become normative. We're all dealing with trauma on one level or another, some more deeply than others, but there's a lot going on. So I think the more we pay attention to some of these reactions or responses or roles that we can fall into, there's a few that, for the sake of time, maybe we're not going to dive too deeply into, but there's a few others within the storyline that I think we might just bullet point or kind of highlight here.
Yeah.
So the strong one who was lifting the gigantic plant in that video clip, Louisa, she's kind of the caretaker, the rescuer of the family. She's sort of the parent surrogate. She's helping, doing everything. She's a doer, and she's trying to keep everyone happy, and she's serving the community, but she's also kind of a slave in service to everyone. And she's exhausted, and she feels inadequate. And once she once Mirabel starts asking questions, Louisa is one of the first people whose magical powers begin to become inconsistent, and she starts to become less strong. And that's her whole reason for being in this family. And she has no idea what to do with herself when she's not taking care of everyone, right?
Absolutely.
So I think within, as you say, within church communities, I think we can identify Louisas. I think there are people who, that's what we do. We just do. We take care of, we do. We're in constant movement mode trying to care for people, but it's not always clear that those people always experience what they need from church. And I'll just say this to be a Mirabel. I've been in multiple churches, and each time I see various Louisas. I see these strong people do amazing things and then abruptly leave. And I think that that's part of the trauma of a group, is that the strong people in an organization can burn out and find themselves no longer feeling like they have a purpose, or they can continue to sustain that purpose, and they leave. There's also another group of people who I see leave, which are the Antonios. Antonio is kind of it turns out to be one of the most pivotal people in the plot line, and yet, ironically, or maybe intentionally, you never really see or hear much about him. He kind of hides. He's introverted. He's inconspicuous. He's literally hiding in the beginning of the story, and Mirabel has to come find him. We've got a number of those people as well. The people that you forget are even part of an organization until suddenly they're no longer there. And I think that's another family role. And then you've got all kinds of other people. You've got Camilo. He's the jester. He's all about shape-shifting and amusing people and distracting from the difficulties going on. We had mentioned that the hero, or the golden child. You've got Isabella, she's the perfectionist. She's the most rigid in terms of denial. I think she's kind of the younger generation of Abuela. And she gets a lot of the attention. She gets all the accolades. Everyone's throwing roses at her feet that she magically grew. But she's not necessarily contributing much more than on this very superficial level. She's the one who makes everyone look good. She's the one who helps rescue the family from the shame of dysfunction by painting a happy face on it, but not necessarily doing anything significant. She's just branding. She's marketing. I think each of these roles, if we look hard enough, and sometimes you don't have to look that hard, you can see them in any organization. And our church is no different. I think we can probably identify who we are in terms of our role in an organization. And that's not to say that all roles are dysfunctional. We've got lots of really strong functional roles. We're still surviving despite all of the difficulties. But it is to say, any traumas that we've endured coming to this place, whether it's traumas in our religious background, or traumas in our families, or traumas in our personal lives, we carry them with us, and we collect them together as a group. And we got to talk about them, like Bruno.
I think we take the role, whatever role we've had in our lives, that's the role we bring, and then it gets magnified. Can we talk about, Bruno, the one everybody has to tiptoe around, the aunt who changes the weather.
Yeah, she's great.
I don't want to make her upset, right?
She's great. Yeah. Yeah, Pepa. She's the mom of several of the people. It's funny, the middle generation between Abuela and the grandkids, we don't hear much about them. Julieta, who is Mirabel's mom, she's the one who, her gift, her magic is she literally has the power to cook healing foods. It's hard to think of something that is more sort of traditional, kind of Colombian Latina than that. Is, I literally cook foods and it heals people. But Pepa, the one who controls the weather, she is super emotional. People describe her as kind of hyper emotional, and everyone has to tiptoe around her because literally when she gets agitated or upset, storms happen, hurricanes happen, which again I think is such a beautiful image for the more emotional among us. Yeah, in a at least a figurative sense, we do have a way of people who are super emotional can kind of create um, commotion and create turmoil. And it's not to say emotion is bad or destructive, but it is to say I think they're speaking to a truth here that sometimes people who have a heightened level of emotionality tend to be the impetus of change or of motion within a family or within a church or within any organization.
So when we recognize these things, and we are who we are, right? We have the histories we have, and we are who we are. But when we recognize that, maybe we can begin to change the system if the system isn't working well for us.
Right. That certainly seems to be the moral of the story here, is that um, honest appraisal of oneself and those around ourselves, but probably ourselves first. Um, that seems to be the thing that at least brings us to happily ever after in Disney. And I think it is the thing that helps us to get along with each other better and to be more effective in groups, is to understand ourselves to the best of our ability and to understand those around us and to be honest, even when that honesty seems um, like it goes against the grain of what we're supposed to do. I think speaking truth to reality is powerful. It's not always easy or fun, and it can have some real impact on things. It can crack the foundation of a casita, but hopefully the rebuilding makes things stronger.
And it's healing.
It sure is.
I have really enjoyed talking about Bruno with you, Steph.
Likewise, this has been fun.
I hope that this has been enjoyable for the rest of you too. And if you haven't seen the movie yet, go see it.
And we're not getting any kind of kickback from Disney on that, so this is an unpaid endorsement. But there's Disney's been doing. I gotta say, I'll just put in a plug for kids programming, kids in parentheses or in quotes, um, shows like Up and Inside Out and Encanto. They're doing an increasingly really nice job, I think, of getting to some very real, very salient, important issues. Um, and the kids have the benefit of getting that stuff. But even if you don't have kids or grandkids or great grandkids to watch these things with, check them out. It's worth watching some of this material. I think you'll find as an adult, there's a lot of depth to it there it's worth spending the time and watching a so-called kids show.